Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we'll be completing the piece we was reading under A Testament of Hope by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which the piece we was reading was called A Testament of Hope. I didn't get very far last time as I had recently my teeth pulled, so I couldn't talk very well, but we will try to continue the rest of this today. Yet the largest portion of white America is still poisoned by racism, which is as native to our soil as pine trees, sagebrush, and buffalo grass. Equally native to us is the concept that gross exploitation of the Negro is acceptable, if not commendable. Many whites thus concede that Negroes should have equal access to public facilities and the untrammeled right to vote cannot understand that we do not intend to remain in the basement of the economic structure. They cannot understand that why a porter or a housemaid would dare dream of a day when his work will be more useful, more remunerative, and a pathway to rising opportunity. This incomprehension is a heavy burden in our efforts to win white allies for the long struggle. But the American Negro has in his nature the spiritual and worldly fortitude to eventually win his struggle for justice and freedom. It is a fortitude to eventually win his struggle. It is a moral fortitude that has been forged by centuries of oppression in their sorrow and their hardship. Negroes have become almost instinctively cohesive. We band together readily, and against white hostility, we have an intense and wholesome loyalty to one another. But we cannot win our struggle for justice all alone. Nor do I think that most Negroes want to exclude well-intentioned whites from participation in the Black Revolution. I believe there is an important place in our struggle for white liberals, and I hope that their present estrangement from our movement is only temporary. But many white people in the past joined our movement with a kind of messianic faith that they were going to save the Negro and solve all of his problems very quickly. They tended, in some instances, to be rather aggressive and insensitive to the opinions and abilities of the black people with whom they were working. This has been especially true of students. In many cases, they simply do not know how to work in a supporting secondary role. I think the problem became most evident when young men and women from the elite northern universities came down to Mississippi to work with the black students at Tougaloo and Rust colleges, who were not quite as articulate, didn't type quite as fast, and were not as sophisticated, inevitably feeling of white paternalism and black inferiority became exaggerated. The Negroes who rebelled against white liberals were trying to reassert their own equality and to cast off the mantle of paternalism. Fortunately, we haven't had this problem in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Most of the white people who were working with us in 1962 and 63 are still with us. We have always enjoyed a relationship of mutual respect, but I think a great many white liberals outside SCLC also have learned this basic lesson in human relations, thanks largely to Jimmy Baldwin and others who have articulated some of the problems of being black in a multiracial society. And I am happy to report that relationships between whites and Negroes in the human rights movement are now on a much healthier basis. In society at large, abrasion between the races is far more evident, but the hostility was always there. Relations today are different only in the sense that Negroes are expressing the feelings that were so long muted. The constructive achievements of the decade 1955 to 1965 deceived us. Everyone underestimated the amount of violence and rage Negroes were suppressing and the vast amount of bigotry the white majority was disguising. All black organizations are a reflection of that alienation, but they are only a contemporary way station on the road to freedom. They are a product of this period of identity crisis and directionless confusion. As a human rights movement becomes more confident and aggressive, more nonviolently active, many of these emotional and intellectual problems will be resolved. In the heat of battle, and we will not ask what is our neighbor's color, but whether he is a brother in pursuit of racial justice. For much of the fervent idealism of the white liberals has been supplemented recently by dispassionate recognition of some of the cold realities of the struggle for that justice. One of the most basic of these realities was pointed out by the President's Riot Commission, which observed that the nature of the American economy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries made it possible for the European immigrants of the time to escape from poverty. It was an economy that had room for, even a great need for, unskilled manual labor jobs. Jobs were available for willing workers, even those with the educational and language liabilities they had brought with them. But the American economy today is radically different. There are fewer and fewer jobs, and the culturally and educationally deprived thus does present day poverty feed upon and perpetuate itself. The Negro today cannot escape from the ghetto in the way that the Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Polish immigrants escaped from the ghettos 50 years ago. New methods of escape must be found, and one of these roads to escape will be a more equitable sharing of the political power between Negroes and whites. Integration is meaningless without the sharing of power. When I speak of integration, I don't mean a romantic mixing of colors. I mean a real sharing of power and responsibility. We will eventually achieve this, but it is going to be much more difficult for us than for any other minority. After all, no other minority has been so constantly, brutally, and deliberately exploited, but because of this very exploitation, Negroes bring a special spiritual and moral contribution to American life, a contribution without which America could not survive. The implications of the true integration are more than just national in scope. I don't believe we can have world peace until America has an integrated foreign policy. Our disastrous experiences in Vietnam and the Dominican Republic have been, in one sense, a result of racist decision making. Men in the white West, whether or not they like it, have grown up in a racist culture and their thinking is colored by that fact. They have been fed on a false mythology of and tradition that blinds them to the aspirations and talents of other men. They don't really respect anyone who is not white, but we simply cannot have peace in the world without mutual respect. I honestly feel that a man without racial blindness, or even better, a man with personal experience of racial discrimination, would be in a much better position to make policy decisions and to conduct negotiations with the underprivileged and emerging nations of the world, or even with Castro for that matter, than would an Eisenhower or a Dulles. The American Marines might not even have been needed in Santo Domingo had the American ambassador there been a man who was sensitive to the color dynamics that pervade the national life of the Dominican Republic. Black men in positions of power in the business world would not be so conscious, unconscionable as to trade or traffic with the Union of South Africa, nor would they be so insensitive to the problems that and needs of Latin America that they would continue the patterns of American exploitation that now prevail there. When we replace the rapidly segregationist chairman of the Armed Services Committee with a man of goodwill, when our ambassadors reflect a creative and wholesome interracial background, rather than a cultural heritage that is a conglomeration of Texas and Georgia politics, then we will be able to bring about the qualitative difference to the nature of American foreign policy. This is what we mean when we talk about redeeming the soul of America. Let me make it clear that I don't think white men have a monopoly on sin or greed, but I think there has been a kind of collective experience, a kind of shared misery in the black community that makes it a little harder for us to exploit other people. I have come to hope that American Negroes can be a bridge between white civilization and the non white nations of the world because we have roots in both. Spiritually, Negroes identify understandably with Africa, an identification that is rooted largely in our color. But all of us are a part of the white American world too. Our education has been Western, and our language, our attitudes, though we sometimes tend to deny it, are very much influenced by Western civilization. Even our emotional life has been disciplined and sometimes stifled and inhibited by an essentially European upbringing. So, although in one sense we are neither, and in another sense we are both American and Africans, our very bloodlines are a mixture. I hope and feel that out of the universality of our experience, we can help make peace and harmony in the world more possible. Although American Negroes could, if they were in the decision making positions, give the encouragement to the underprivileged and the disenfranchised people of other lands, I don't think it can work the other way around. I don't think the non whites in other parts of the world can really be any concrete help to us given their own problems of development and self determination. In fact, American Negroes are greater collective buying power than Canada, greater than all four of the Scandinavian countries combined. American Negroes have greater economic potential than most of the nations, perhaps even more than all of the nations of Africa. We don't need to look for help from other power outside the boundaries of our country, except in the sense of sympathy and identification. Our challenge, rather, is to organize the power we already have been prevented by more aggressive political involvement on the part of that city's Negroes. There is utterly no reason a Denizio should be the mayor of Newark, and with the Negro majority that exists in that city. Gary, Indiana is another tinderbox city, but its black mayor, Richard Hatcher, has given Negroes a new faith in the effectiveness of the political process. One of the most basic weapons in the fight for social justice will be the cumulative political power of the Negro. I can foresee the Negro vote becoming consistently the decisive vote in national elections. It is already decisive in states that have large numbers of electoral votes. Even today, the Negroes in New York City strongly influence the New York State will go in national elections. And the Negroes in Chicago have a similar leverage in Illinois. Negroes are even the decisive balance of power in the elections in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. So the party and the candidate that get the support of the Negro voter in national elections have a very definite edge. And we intend to use this fact to win advances in the struggle for human rights. I have every confidence that the black vote will ultimately help unseat the die-hard opponents of the equal rights in Congress, who are incidentally reactionary on all issues. But the Negro community cannot win this victory alone. Indeed, it would be an empty victory even if the Negroes could win it alone. Intelligent men of goodwill everywhere must see this as their task and contribute to its support. The election of Negro mayors such as Hatcher in some of the nation's larger cities has also had a tremendous psychological impact upon the Negro. It has shown him that he has the potential to participate in the determination of his own destiny and that of society. We will see more Negro mayors in major cities in the next 10 years. But this is not the ultimate answer. Mayors are relatively impotent figures in the scheme of national politics. Even a white mayor such as John Lindsay of New York simply does not have the money and resources to deal with the problems of his city. The necessary money to deal with the urban problems must come from the federal government, and this money is ultimately controlled by the Congress of the United States. The success of these enlightened mayors is entirely dependent upon the financial support made available by Washington. The past record of the federal government, however, has not been encouraging. No president has really done very much for the American Negro, though the past two presidents have received much undeserved credit for helping us. This credit has accrued to Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy only because it was during their administration that Negroes began doing more for themselves. Kennedy didn't voluntarily submit a civil rights bill, nor did Lyndon Johnson. In fact, both told us at one time that such legislation was impossible. President Johnson did respond realistically to the signs of the times and used his skills as a legislator to get bills through Congress that other men might not have gotten through. I must point out, in all honesty, however, that President Johnson has not been nearly so diligent in implementing the bills he has helped shepherd through Congress. Of the 10 titles in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, probably the only one concerning public accommodations, the most bitterly contested section has been meaningly enforced and implemented. Most of the other sections have been deliberately ignored. The same is true for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which provides for federal referees to monitor the registration of voters in counties where Negroes have systematically been denied the right to vote. Yet, of the some 900 counties that are eligible for federal referees, only 58 counties to date have had them. The other 842 other counties remain essentially just as they were before the March on Selma. Look at the pattern of federal referees in Mississippi, for example. They are dispersed in a manner that gives the appearance of change without any real prospect of actually shifting political power or giving Negroes a genuine opportunity to be represented in the government of their state. There is a similar pattern in Alabama, even though that state is currently at odds with the Democratic administration in Washington because of George Wallace. Georgia, until just recently, had no federal referees at all, not even in the hardcore black belt countries. I think it is significant that there are no federal referees at all in the home districts of the most powerful Southern senators, particularly Senators Russell, Eastland, and Talmadge. The power and moral corruption of these senators remain unchallenged despite the weapon for change the legislation promised to be uh, reform was thwarted when the legislation was inadvertently forced. But not all is bad in the South by any means. Though the fruits of our struggle have sometimes been nothing more than bitter despair, I must admit there have been some hopeful signs, some meaningful successes. One of the most hopeful of these changes is an attitude of the Southern Negro himself. Benign acceptance of the second class citizenship has been displaced by vigorous demands for full citizenship rights and opportunities. In fact, most of our concrete accomplishments have been limited largely to the South. We have put an end to racial segregation in the South. We have brought about the beginnings of reform in the political system, and as incongruous as it may seem, a Negro is probably safer in most southern cities than he is in the cities of the North. We have confronted the racist policemen of the South and demanded reforms in the police departments. We have confronted the Southern racist power structure and have elected Negro and liberal white candidates through much of the South in the past 10 years. George Wallace is certainly an exception, and Lester Maddox is a sociological fossil. But despite these anachronisms, at the city and county level, there is new respect for black votes and black citizenship that just did not exist 10 years ago. Though school integration has moved at a depressingly slow rate in the South, it has moved. Of far more significance is the fact that we have learned that the integration of schools does not necessarily solve the inadequacy of schools. White schools are often just about as bad as black schools, and integrated schools sometimes tend to merge the problems of the two without solving either of them. There is progress in the South, however, progress expressed by the presence of Negroes in the Georgia House of Representatives, in the election of a Negro in the Mississippi House of Representatives, in the election of a black sheriff in Tuskegee, Alabama, and most especially in the integration of police forces throughout the southern states. There are now even Negro deputy sheriffs in such black belt areas as Dallas County, Alabama. Just 3 years ago, a Negro could be beaten for going into the county courthouse in Dallas County. Now Negroes are in running it. So there are some changes, but the changes are basically in the social and political areas. The problems are now face providing jobs, better housing, and better education for the poor throughout the country and will require money for their solution. A fact that makes those solutions all the more difficult. The need for solutions, meanwhile, becomes more urgent every day because of these problems are far more serious than they were just a few years ago. Before 1964, things were getting better economically for the Negro, but after that year, things began to take a turn for the worse. In particular, automation began to cut into our jobs very badly, and this snuffed out the few sparks of hope the black people had begun to nurture. As long as there are some measurable and steady economic progress, Negroes were willing and able to press harder and work harder and hope for something better. But when the floor began to close on the few avenues of progress, then homeless despair began to set in. The fact that most white people do not comprehend this situation, which prevails in the North as well as in the South, is due largely to the press, which molds the opinions of the white community. Many whites hasten to congratulate themselves on what little progress we Negroes have made. I'm sure that most whites felt that with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, all race problems were automatically solved because most white people are so far removed from the life of the average Negro, there has been little to challenge this assumption. Yet Negroes continue to live with racism every day. It doesn't matter where we are individually in the scheme of things, how near we may be either to the top or to the bottom of society. The cold facts of racism slap every one of us in the face. A friend of mine is a lawyer, one of the most brilliant young men I know. Were he a white lawyer, I have no doubt that he would be $100,000 job without a major corporation or heading his own independent with a major corporation or heading his own independent firm. As it is, he makes a mere $20,000 a year. This may seem like a lot of money, and to most of us it is. But the point is that this young man's background and abilities would, if his skin color were different, entitle him to an income many times that amount. We're going to stop there because this has already been almost 35 minutes. But yeah, Dr. King talking about even though there have been these forms of quote legislation to better the lives many African Americans. It just hasn't been enforced to take the kind of effect it needs to. Yes, there are things that have been done to better life for the African American, but he still is struggling with the effects of racism in day-to-day life. But as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.